Hi, I'm Alan Franey, a programmer at VIFF, and during this episode, we'll be speaking with Mark Levinson about his film in the festival, The Universe in a Grain of Sand, which is a very ambitious film trying to get to the meanings of art and science, how people have been inspired by the world and investigated it through science and celebrated it through art. Welcome to the VIFF podcast. This is your chance to get inside track from the people behind the films you love and the films you're yet to discover. This podcast was recorded on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, recorded during the 43rd edition of the Vancouver International Film Festival. These conversations take us behind the scenes with the creators, bringing their work to the big screen. I'm Alan Franey, and this week I'll be in conversation with Mark Levinson, who's here at the festival with The Universe in a Grain of Sand. Now, this is a film that is about the intersection of art, science, and all that concerns art and science, which is the entire universe, how we got there, how the pieces fit together, how we can be inspired by them, etc., etc. So, Mark, you've been a guest of this festival before with a film called Particle Fever, which was a look into the world of physics and specifically particle colliders and new frontiers in thought of how the world is made. So you have a background in science, and this film crosses more than your previous work into the realm of visual art, both what we think of as painters, sculptors, new media artists, but also filmmakers. So can we start with you just explaining a bit about your own background and this trajectory of science and art?
Yes, so I did start in the hard sciences in every sense of the word, and I actually got a doctorate in theoretical particle physics. I think that, I actually started, I was in a medical MD PhD program, and I got distracted by physics. And I think what appealed to me was there was a beauty to it. I was a theorist, and a lot of the sciences and physics, especially, the difference between theorists and experimentalists is huge. In fact, I used to joke that I met more experimental physicists when I was making the film than when I was actually a physicist, because you were in this enclave. And for me, it was just, physics was sort of the epitome of man's attempt to understand the universe. And there was a beauty to the math. Even in the theoretical physics community, there's a spectrum of people that are closer or further from experiments. And I was like the furthest. It was like I would have been happy just playing with the math and beauty of it. So I think that was the appeal of physics. Now, the same things that make it less connected to actual reality is what it also makes it harder to get jobs. And that was okay. I thought I was going to be in a university setting or something like that. And particle physics at the time had a standard model, and it was the best theory we have of how the universe works. And there was one thing that they were waiting for that was crucial to the standard model of particle physics, and it was something called the Higgs boson. And that had been established, and they couldn't find the Higgs boson, and they were planning on accelerators to do it. And physics was in a little bit of a stagnant phase. And so when I finished my degree, there was a certain concern, well, where am I going to go? What's going to be the next step? And at the same time, I had really discovered film. And I had enjoyed film as a kid, but I don't think I ever thought of it as a career. It's like somehow these things just appeared, these films, that people didn't really make them. And then I was at Berkeley, and there was an archive there called the Pacific Film Archive. And this was an amazing resource for seeing all sorts of films, international films, experimental films. And I volunteered to be a projectionist, and they had a little research screening room. And so I would get to meet some filmmakers, but I could see any films I wanted. And I, in particular, saw a lot of European cinema. I really discovered sort of art films, Eastern European films, and also some experimental films. And I happened to be living with this in an in-law apartment with this old typical Berkeley radical intellectual couple, and they would go and we would have these unbelievable discussions about these films. And I began to think, well, films, in a sense, they're a theory of the way the world works as well. I mean, I think that a really good film, a script, it's the filmmaker's interpretation of, it's a compression of something about the way the world operates that has some universal truth to it, like an equation or something in physics. And so it was the first time I began to think, oh, maybe this would be another way to deal with the universe. And instead of dealing with the physical universe, dealing more with the human side. And so I formally sort of took a gap from getting a postdoc, which you have to do in this field. You'd have to do a couple, and started to work on films. And I just sort of fell in love with it. I mean, it was really exciting.
So the biographical elements really interest me. So just before we talk about the film more, just very briefly to get a sense of this. So you were at Berkeley in the 70s when you were being a projectionist, perhaps?
Late 70s.
Late 70s. And then
early
you
80s,
ended
yeah.
up on the East Coast. You live in New York now, but you've spent a lot of time at MIT as well, correct?
No. I actually stayed at Berkeley for quite a long time. So I got my PhD there. Another factor is I met my wife, and she was finishing at Berkeley, so there was another incentive not to leave right away and do a postdoc. No, I stayed in Berkeley, and of course I went to Berkeley for physics, and then suddenly I was interested in film. But it turns out that basically 10 minutes away from me in my home was the Salzans Film Center. And I answered an ad. There was an independent film organization called the Film Arts Foundation, and they had a newsletter, and there was this thing release print, and they were looking for production assistant interns. And so I answered it, and I know some of the people that I took my resume and said, oh, this guy has a PhD in physics. Either he's really a moron, in human ways, or he'll do some filing. And so I actually got involved in this film, and I was on the set, I was doing PA stuff, but then I met the editor, and he invited me to come because I could project, so I projected daily. So I met the editor, director, producer. He invited me to come and work on the editing, and they were doing it at the Salzans Film Center. So serendipitously, it was happening right there. So I got involved. It was a sort of soup to nuts, literally, because I first did craft services, I did art thing, then I did editing, and it became a path to getting involved in film is through the editing. And on that film, we did the picture editing, we did the sound editing, which is unusual for a bigger film. And it was an interesting independent film. And I didn't realize how rare that was in the Bay Area. It was a smooth talk. So it was the first film that Laura Dern really got attention, and Treat Williams and Joyce Chopra directed it. And so I sort of forged this career in post-production, at first in editing, and then I actually specialized in post-production recording of sound and dialogue editing, and then what's called ADR, where you work with the actors in post-production. And at the Salzans Film Center, they had won the Oscar in sound for Amadeus. And so productions would come and they'd do their sound there. And so my day job became really working on these big narrative features, doing the ADR. I wanted to be directing, and this became in a sense, a secret way to work with great actors, because I worked on The English Patient and Talented Mr. Ripley, various things that were done there. But I was in Berkeley overall, I was there for 30 years. I never went to MIT, actually. So I was in Berkeley for quite a while, and then we moved to New York in about 2006, actually.
Okay. So people listening to this podcast will include regular festival goers and cineasts, and for continuity's sake, it might be interesting, as you were talking about filmmakers and discovering this world of theory of filmmaking and so on. There's a strong connection between San Francisco Pacific Film Archives and the Vancouver scene. Experimental filmmakers, people like Al Rizzutis and Dave Rimmer, and the conversation back and forth between California and Vancouver. So a lot of people who are filmmakers here studied at universities here, from professors who were conversant with this kind of bridge. And probably for you, like for me, I mean, we thought seriously about the early theorists of cinema who were great filmmakers, but they talked about it in terms of the theory of what they were doing. And that's represented in your film to a certain extent. So people like Vertov and Eisenstein, these were people who really affected how people thought about cinema and how people edited and constructed a shot. And it was very inspirational. So you've ended up in this place of showing some of these films and clips in this current movie, The Universe in a Grain of Sand. So although we're talking about particle physics on one hand, we're also talking about the greatest expressions of film theory on the big screen that we've enjoyed throughout our lives. And then there's this middle place where you're talking about the history of technology and in general, and how it's affected our life and history, and how our minds have found ways, or perhaps are programmed to find ways to invent things like wheels and indoor plumbing and computers and artificial intelligence. So this is such a huge field of inquiry. I wondered when I was watching your film, you've sort of gone even bigger this time. How did you find a focus? How did you, considering you're talking about everything, how did you find it before you could describe it to yourself? Or did you know from the beginning that you were talking about that point of intersection?
No, I mean, it was a very unusual project, actually. I mean, the most unusual for me, and the result was so unusual. I mean, you very aptly pointed out it's very different, the most visual of all of my films. I mean, Particle Fever ended up being very much a character and dramatic story. I didn't know that at the beginning, but that took it over. I made another film in between called The Bit Player about Claude Shannon, and that was focused about Claude Shannon. It was a hybrid. It had narrative and other elements, and unfortunately came out during COVID. Otherwise, I would have hoped to have shown it at VIFF. This one actually started with a dinner with the director of research at IBM, who was a huge fan of Particle Fever. And in fact, I had heard through a mutual friend that he excerpted a piece from Particle Fever, and he would use this in talks. And what the piece was where this, we called him the Greek philosopher, Savas Dimopoulos, the physicist, talks about what distinguishes a really great scientist. And Savas says, okay, they have to have a modicum of intelligence. But what really makes a great scientist is artistic taste, that they have to have the ability to identify a problem that has not been solved, that is important, and that the time for solving it has come now. And this was an interesting point on when I was making Particle Fever, too, because it gets to this whole parallel. But a mutual friend said that Dario would love to maybe have dinner and just talk about things. And we went to dinner, and Dario is just an incredibly cultured person. I mean, besides being an engineer and artist, he's interested in, I mean, an engineer and a scientist, he's also interested in the arts. And I remember the first time I met him, I went into his office, and there's a picture of Glenn Gould from when he recorded the Goldberg Variations. And so we just had this discussion, and Dario started talking to me about how he thinks we're at an inflection point in technology, where we've gotten used to our chips getting smaller and smaller and smaller and faster, and that we're reaching a point we could foresee where we can't do it anymore. We're going to reach the physical limits, and that there's hints that the advances may come from an analog approach, not digital, and that he thought that was good and interesting because it, connects us to how the real world is. And we just started talking about what directions things are going to go in, and he asked, would you be interested in maybe doing a film for us? And I was certainly not interested in doing an IBM film, a film about IBM. But it was really an open mandate. And so I just started thinking, what could be an interesting way to make, what would be an interesting story? And Dario himself talked about bits and neurons and qubits, and that, there were these various things that, could be other paths. So I started thinking about, for me, what would be an interesting film is what all my films are ultimately is, how do we make sense of the world? How do we make sense of the universe? I'm not interested in specifics. I'm not interested in specifics of technology. I'm interested in how do we make sense of the world as a scientist, as a filmmaker. And what occurred to me is that the way we make sense of the world, the computers are one tool, but there's been a whole history that the way we make sense of the world is through the tools we have to interact with it, whether it's a lens or a computer. And I thought, oh, that's sort of an interesting narrative that I could follow. And then it struck me, I actually, and this is something I'm myself a little fuzzy on, is what made me first think about using the works of experimental filmmakers. I think it was the fact that I knew what was interesting to me about a lot of the experimental filmmakers is that, they would play with things. They would create images that could never possibly happen in real life. You could have people on top of each other and things like that, but we never question it in film. But these principles in physics are very hard to describe to lay people. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. There's some examples of things there. And so I was thinking, well, could I do a narrative and not explain things, but maybe use the works of experimental filmmakers to accompany it. Mm-hmm. And there was one film by this woman, Erin Espily, called the Lanthanide series. And the Lanthanide series are a row in the periodic table. They're called the rare earth elements. And her film is a very poetic essay, but in part of it, she talks about the fact that essentially everything in our modern computers, the screens, this, that, batteries, they are all based on things in the Lanthanide series. And it sort of struck me like, wow, everything is in the dirt. I mean, and so that really sort of focused me on the fact that we could look at the history of our tools and developments, but it's a circle with the more we understood about nature, the more we could create tools that could allow us to do more, and that there was a parallel between scientists and artists also from the first days of maybe, they had a charred piece of wood scraping on a cave wall to being able to paint, to being able to use computers and being able to use AI, and who knows if they'll ever be using quantum computers, but probably they will.
I think maybe for listeners who may not have seen the film yet, let's paint a bit of sort of more color to picture of it. There's images of many kinds, some scientifics, the things you're used to a bit from the world of astronomy or microscopy, but there's also a lot of recognizable images by artists, people whose work brings to mind this intersection of sort of vision, imagination, and the real world. People like Escher, Van Gogh, Mondrian, Hilma af Klint, people like that. And then you have quite a lengthy segment of interview sections with George Dyson and other scientists. Can you tell us a bit about George Dyson? Because he's important to the film.
Yeah, so George is it's an interesting example. I had met George a number of years ago. I have a narrative script that I written. It's an adaptation of Richard Powers' novel, The Goldbug Variations, and my initial venture into film was narrative fiction. That's what I really was planning on doing, and I had been looking for something that really integrated it in a very non-gratuitous way, and I don't think many films do that with science. And so I had a script that had been selected for support from the Sloan Foundation, and they gave me the Sundance Screenplay Lab, and they had a conference and of people who had Sloan grants, and George was there with another project. And so I met George, and I knew who he was somewhat because George's father is a very, very famous physicist. So I knew Freeman Dyson, his father, who worked on quantum electrodynamics with Feynman. A lot of people think he really should have gotten a Nobel himself. And I knew Freeman, I knew the Dyson-Schwinger equations from physics. So I liked George, and George was, a bit of a renegade. He sort of, I think, in opposition to his father and his mother, who was a mathematician. He sort of went off the grid literally. He didn't even go to college. Then I think he went to college for a semester at Berkeley, of all things. Then he moved up to Seattle area, and he built a tree house and lived in a tree house for 7 years. And then his sister, Esther Dyson, who became sort of one of the internet pioneers and was on the organization that founded the domain name system, she sort of pulled him invited him to some tech conference. And he got absorbed in it, and he ended up writing a book called Turing's Cathedral, which was about the fact that when he was at the Institute for Advanced Study growing up, that's where Freeman Dyson was, or Einstein was, that John von Neumann had made one of the first computers there, and George and his buddies would go into this warehouse, and there were like all these parts of computers, and he wrote this book about the origins of the computers with von Neumann. And when I was traveling for the bid player, I met somebody else who had been the project that George Dyson had advised on. And when I told her about my idea for the universe in a grain of sand, she said, "Oh, George is writing a book called Analogia. And it's about the whole history of, coming back to analog computing." So I contacted George, and it was amazing. He really sent me a draft. The book was not out, and it encapsulated a lot of ideas that helped me shape the script. So in the film, for instance, I talk about sort of the origins of the idea of a digital age, going back to Leibniz, which I actually didn't know myself, but it was in George's book. And so he actually really helped sculpt some of the early stories, the parallels to the I Ching. And George is he's not anti-technology, but he's skeptical a little bit, and He's very concerned with the sort of the system way in which things are put together. So he's an interesting mix. He was perfect for me in some ways because he's really bright, and he pulls in all these different things, and so it really helped sort of shape that part of the story.
I think it's worth mentioning that apart from what he and many of the other speakers saying is actually quite beautiful and inspirational, he's got an artist's eye, and I know he's a person of the Pacific Northwest. He lives. You get to see his studio where he's working on kayaks, and I know he's done a lot of exploring in BC and written
Yeah.
books about kayaking. He's known for that. But he's someone who understands the history of technology, and it's sort of incarnated in this beautiful studio he's created with all these books and a piano and maps. It was aesthetically inspirational for me too, getting completely away from the computers and just looking at the physical material space of beauty that we can create around ourselves.
Do you know him or?
No, I don't know him.
So you're doing the screening, you're right on Sun. So he's going to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting him.
Yeah. So that'll be interesting.
There's a lot of interesting people in your film and artists, and a very long list of important artists and contemporary artists that we get to hear from. And what struck me is, your film is sort of showing up important, like making it simple for us to understand some differences. Like, for example, between how computers work and how the brain works. Differences between digital and analog that we might not have thought of, and how quantum computing reinvents classical computing. So there's these binaries in a way that you're going back and forth between, but in the end, it's all about swirling complexities, right? Sort of that idea of the universe in a grain of sand, and sort of going down like into a looking glass world, if you want. That's sort of dizzying and beautiful on screen. So is this something you'd spend a lot of time with before, or researching? Were you going to the library and looking online for examples of visual art that suited your subject this time?
No. Well, I didn't go to the library. First of all, it was COVID when I started. Second, everything's online. Although I'm a big supporter of libraries, actually. What happened is, when I had this idea of using experimental films, I coincidentally, I read an article in Filmmaker magazine, of all things, and it was about the fact that on Ad Astra, they had 2 experimental filmmakers as advisors, Leo Goldsmith and Greg Zinman. And I thought, wow. And I thought that's interesting, that the filmmaker wanted to have something visually different. And so he had hired these people. And it turns out I had a connection to them. And Leo lives in New York. And so I reached out, and this was a time when I couldn't shoot anything. It really was the depths of COVID. But I thought, well, maybe I'll hire them, or at least talk to them, and get some ideas. And so I contacted Leo, who was in New York, and happily didn't just sort of dismiss me, and thought, this sounds interesting. And he said he often works with Greg, and maybe they would start to consult. And so we started a process where almost every week we would have a Zoom call, and they would send me ideas of filmmakers and clips of things to look at. And the story was still pretty rough. I mean, I knew it had started to take this shape that I knew I wanted to get this sort of narrative development from the earliest ideas of machines, references to lenses and things like that, but then to machines, and really sort of especially the technological developments through early ideas of digital to mechanical things, to vacuum tubes, to semiconductors, and then, to a modern era of using other things we've learned about in biology or quantum. And so they would send me things, and we talk about them, and I tell them, yeah, this is something that resonates. And so we assembled this huge database of, a couple hundred different clips. And at a certain point I said, well, there's a lot of material here. Maybe I should write a script and see, where things could go. And so I wrote a script with ideas like, okay, maybe we could use brackage here, and maybe we could use this here, and maybe we could use this here, and I don't know what we'll use here, but we started to get something together, and that became the process. So they became my secret weapon. And the great thing is they actually knew a lot of the artists. So, they would often make the introductions, or they would first reach out to them, and that became the source for a lot of the experimental films, actually, and the images. Partly from my perspective is, okay, in a typical science film, you could talk about scientific ideas, and then you could hire a graphic artist team or animation, and they would animate it. And what I had been thinking is, these people, they can spend years working on one piece. What am I going to get when I hire somebody for a couple months? And they have so much else. And so there was, part of my justification, or the appeal of this was, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that these were artists and they really worked on things. And I wanted to use it and spotlight it.
So you include some very famous, important sculptors, and just sort of like to make things concrete. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can, I know from watching the film, but how would you put it in your own words, how the work, say, of Richard Serra fits into this conception of scientific inquiry?
Well, Richard Serra is a very interesting example of, in fact, the brilliance of Dario and my choosing Dario, because in my first interview with Dario, we did one formal interview initially, and at the end, I said, "Are there any artists that you particularly are interested in?" And I often ask this of scientists. I've done it on Particle Fever, and a lot of times people don't have any idea. And Dario immediately said Richard Serra, and he basically said what's in the film, that he just thinks it's amazing the way he sculpted these things, and he had to learn about how to make these. So for people who don't know, some of Richard Serra's famous things are called the torqued ellipses, and they're these enormous plates of steel that rust colored, and they're bent in ways that you sort of walk into them. And as Dario says in the film, it's amazing they can even stand. And so essentially that is from the first interview. And so then, of course, it was like, wow, okay, well, maybe we can film some of them. And it turns out that Dia Beacon outside of New York has the biggest collection of Richard Serra's. And so we were able to get permission to go there and film Dario walking through it, which he was unbelievably thrilled about. And then we found this documentary that was made by Art 21. And Richard Serra starts talking about how the way they did this, they had to make models and use computers to figure out how to do this and how to understand the material. And this is the theme of the film. It's about how, artists as well, they need to, they can understand things. They need to understand the nature of nature to be able to depict it in a different way that allows you to look at nature in a different way. Mm-hmm. And so that was a perfect example of it. It was one that really came from Dario. The other one of note is Andy Goldsworthy from Rivers and Tides. And I had seen Rivers and Tides many years before, and I loved it. And so in the early stages of the film, I always thought, oh yeah, I should look back at Rivers and Tides. I didn't remember the details. And then I watched it again, and there was this unbelievable scene where he's making one of his cones with these stacked stones into a cone at the edge of the water. And he starts talking about how he needs to understand the stones. And that, there's an amusing scene where it falls apart, and he says, obviously, I don't understand it well enough yet. But it was, again, just perfect. The idea of an artist working with nature, trying to understand the materials of nature, to do something with it. And what does it represent in the end? Well, that's up to an audience, but it says something about nature and about man's attempt to understand it.
One book that I thought about watching your film, and I don't remember if you referenced it explicitly, but because it was so famous at the time, Gödel, Escher, Bach, which was Douglas Hofstadter's 1979 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, I think, which had a similar effort to talk about, well, in this case, it combined mathematicians' inquiry with Escher's visual representations of space, and then Bach's sublime music, and sort of looking for commonalities and inspiration and the significances between those fields. So you've sort of taken it to the next level. Can you think of important other books or perhaps films in the last 100 years that have aimed to combine, purposefully sort of made comparisons, brought these various fields, art, science, and so on, together to talk about the human brain and form and ultimate meanings?
Well, I have to say, I think the person who does that best is Richard Powers. And that's what really appealed to me with the Goldbug Variations. So the Goldbug Variations is, it's a pun on the Goldberg Variations by Bach, but also the Goldbug, which is a short story by Edgar Allan Poe that's about cryptography. And so it's a story about these people trying to find the lost treasure buried by pirates, and they find a coded message, and it's about trying to decode the message. And Poe was very interested in cryptography. And so anyways, the Goldbug Variations, though, it follows the story of a molecular biologist in the 1950s, in the late 1950s. So it's after Watson and Crick have discovered the structure of DNA. A lot of people think that was the end of the story. We know DNA. But the real story was, how does it work? And so the structure was important. And what they had figured out was that DNA is made up of these 4 different nucleotides, adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And the way that they are ordered together determines things. And they had figured out, they were just figuring out at that time that they seemed to work in triplets, that, it could be like AAC, and that is a gene, or that would code for an amino acid. And so the way life happens is DNA, the structure, the sequence of DNA, it pulls an associated protein, an amino acid together, and the amino acids are put together and they form the proteins, and that's basically what life is. It's these proteins that form the basis and interact and things like that. But the big mystery was that if you take 4 things, 3 at a time, there's 64 different possible combinations, and there's 20 amino acids. And so this was the big mystery, is how do these 64 things assign to 20? Are they duplicate? Are some of them not doing anything? And so the story revolves around a molecular biologist, this young postdoc who's this brilliant person who Life magazine, touts as he's going to, Stuart Ressler's going to discover the secret of life. And the story is about how he gets derailed by falling in love with a married woman in his lab who introduces him to music, and in particular, Bach and the Goldberg Variations. And he begins to think that maybe the key isn't just trying to break the code, but maybe it's music and Bach and other things that you can't do in a lab. So this is, in some sense, this is exactly, as you're saying, it's a story about science, but it's about art as well. And so I still think that's one of the most brilliant examples, and I do hope that I'm going to make that film still.
I think we should turn a bit to the future And maybe I can just put this on the table that we are showing another film in the festival called The Thinking Game. You probably haven't seen it yet.
No.
We have this thematic of AI at the festival this year, which is no surprise given that it's front of mind in so many ways for our civilization now. And this is it's about the DeepMind team that are sponsored by Alphabet, Google, and they're like the biggest brain trust of AI developers, people from all over the world, but working in London, England. So they previously took on the world's best Go player and saw whether this software program could win at Go, which they did. And then this film is going after the holy grail of molecular biology, which is trying to understand, to decode protein folding. So what's interesting about what this film documents, it's this moment where this AI program is so far invisible to the software developers who have created it. They don't know how it's doing it. They're just giving it more and more computing power and time and then orientation, certain, objectives. And the question is, will it be able to solve this mystery? So this comes into your film too, in a certain respect, because you're talking about quantum computing and what this could mean for the future. So I don't think we need to get into some of the political implications or fearsome implications if this is a Pandora's box and, computers start to control us. But sticking with your more sort of optimistic field of inquiry of understanding the world, can you talk a bit about quantum computing and its potential?
Sure. There's two things. Because first you mentioned the AI thing, right? Which is different from the quantum.
But one can facilitate another. If
possibly.
AI is dependent on computing power, and quantum computing would represent a huge leap forward in computing power, then it might be the enabler of
That's
AI.
true. That's true. I think that's the hope, actually, is that, basically, one of the reasons why we are running out of computing power is because of the demands of AI, they're dependent on these enormous databases, and that is pushing our limits in some sense. One of the things that I think is critical, and luckily somebody in the film says this, about quantum computing, is that quantum computing is not just a classical computer, but faster. It's a completely different way of looking at things. And we know ultimately classical computers are not enough to understand some of the biggest problems in the world. And this was actually something that was, for me, an insight in this process, was the realization that a lot of the problems that they always hold out as examples of things that a classical computer can't deal with have to do with nature and our understanding of nature. Photosynthesis is a typical example. Protein folding is another that they really didn't know if they were going to be the Alpha team has actually now seems to have tackled that and been able to do it, which is great. But we know that at a fundamental level, the universe is quantum mechanical. And this is, in some sense, part of the whole narrative of the film, is if we start with a classical idea of doing computations based on just zeros and ones. So a digital representation of what is normally an analog world, which touches on what you were talking about before. The narrative of the film shows that digital gives us a lot, and it represented a huge advance in our ability to calculate and to interpret the world. But we know that there's things that it doesn't address. The human body is a perfect example where we know that genes, in a sense, are digital. So the humans have a digital way of passing on information, but the brain is analog. And we know we need those two things, but what quantum has said is that ultimately we need something else too, which is something that operates the way the quantum world operates, which is this totally different thing, which things seem like they sometimes can be analog, sometimes digital. And what determines it is how we observe it. So it gets to the whole idea of the observer. And so the hope of a quantum machine is that we can make a computer that is itself a quantum system. And we are at the point where we can manipulate some quantum systems to do a calculation. The big challenge is how do we translate our problems into a quantum system? Because the characteristic of a quantum computer is that you have an input, and then basically things happen quantum mechanically that we can't really keep track of. And the art is extracting something that is relevant to the problem that you wanted again. And it's a fascinating thing where you have to sort of get used to the fact that an indeterminate center section can have a determined outcome that is relevant. And this has the potential. I think the things people often hold up as dreams as for drug creation and being able to deal with some of the most cosmological things. But quantum computers are very sensitive because they're quantum mechanical. As soon as you start, the trick is as soon as you start to manipulate things, you change things and you have to control that. But I think it's also, people have to realize that quantum computers, I don't think anybody thinks they will ever be the thing that you use all the time. That, again, just like we use analog and we use digital, I think classical computers are what we will use for a lot of things they're really good at. They're very good at just data processing and things like that. And quantum computers, though, will be used for things that the classical ones are not going to be used for. I don't know if that answers.
Well, it does a bit, but I was sort of trying to stop myself giggling at a certain point because suddenly, I had a good fortune of knowing a great poet, Robin Blazer, who used to say, "The truth is laughter," amongst other things. And I just had, for a moment, I was thinking of your voice. It was like listening to Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park at that moment where he's explaining chaos theory. So, yeah, that we've covered a lot of ground here, and I just wonder, maybe to wrap up, if there's any final thought or thing you'd like to say?
Well, it's interesting with the AI thing because, when I started working on this, it was a couple years ago. And so AI was a thing, but it wasn't the thing like it is now. They were, in fact, at the time, what was really popular was something called generative adversarial networks, was a model. And it sort of has been usurped by the ChatGPTs, which are based on what are called large language models. And I actually had to do a little massaging of the script because they're all based on the same thing, the neural networks. They're all based on a model, which is something I think that's interesting. And I don't know if people realize that the neural networks, which is the basis of all of these AI things that are happening now, there are attempts to understand how to model the brain, which we know is a complex analog thing, but can we model it with digital machines that use zeros and ones? And it is an interesting situation where these models have actually now become our best understanding of the brain. So But what I wanted to say about that is that there's a lot of social issues, as you said, dealing with the AI system. I think that for me, what I realize is the perspective of the film is very different, which is that we should look at AI as another example of how we are getting closer to understanding nature. And those are important social issues, but it should be looked at as its own continuum of we are in some sense fusing more and more with nature itself. That it should. You said that I have an optimistic view, and I mean, I don't know if I would say it's an optimistic view, because I do think the social issues are important, but it's a more broader perspective of how AI it's just like the next step from, vacuum tubes to semiconductors. It's the next step that it's actually tying our technology and our understanding of the universe back to nature. We are making machines that are like brains as the next step in our attempts to understand how nature works at its deepest level. So for me, AI is about another level of possibly understanding what's the nature of creativity. And that's the unifying theme in the film, imagination. I mean, these are the things that, drive us through all of this. And so I see AI in that regard, and I think it's, in that sense, my own feelings and discovery was how we are moving to this unity of man and nature, machines and artists and scientists.
If you had to pick one film to watch on repeat for 24 hours, what would it be?
That's easier. The Double Life of Veronique by Kieślowski. I could watch that for a week.
How many times have you seen it?
I've seen it about a half dozen times, I'd say, actually. And it's interesting because there's a spirituality to it. And I don't consider myself spiritual. And I never, but it's the good spiritual. Mm-hmm. There's something deep. It's not explanatory. And it's just so emotionally compelling. And I just find it's one of those things in its simplicity. It just captures something about the mystery of life and the emotion of life without trying to explain it, without trying to justify it. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah, it's a great film.
It's a great film. Yeah.
Very good. That's a great way to end this. And just let me close by saying that, unlike listening to us here or, listening to a university lecture or reading a book even, what you've made in the universe in a grain of sand is a work of cinema that has all the beauty of the big screen and sound experience. And I really do hope people see it.
Thank you very much.
You have been listening to the VIFF podcast. Thanks to our community broadcast partner, Tell Us Story Hive, for their support. If you're enjoying the show, please rate and review the podcast and be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Visit viff.org to learn more about the Vancouver International Film Festival and see what's on at the VIFF Center year-round.